The situation in the West Philippine Sea is quite troubling. Most recently, after half a dozen different incidents involving Chinese water cannon deployed against Filipino servicemen, not to mention collisions between Chinese and Filipino vessels, now we see Chinese forces forcibly and unilaterally and aggressively boarding and disarming Filipino naval servicemen. There are deep concerns about armed confrontation, and accordingly, should the United States step in, what will be the implications for the West Philippine Sea disputes? But will the United States really step in behalf of the Philippines under the parameters of the Mutual Defense Treaty? After all, the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and US has been shrouded in layers and layers of ambiguity. If you look at the key provisions of the MDT, there's no automaticity when it comes to potential intervention by the United States in behalf of the Philippines. Moreover, only recently did the Trump and Biden administration clarify that the MDT will apply if there were to be armed attack against Filipino personnel, public vessels, and aircrafts in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. The problem, however, is that China is not using conventional armed attack against Filipinos. It is engaging in so-called gray zone activities whereby it uses violence, aggression, intimidation, but not live ammunitions and kinetic actions. What is the history of America's policy in the West Philippine Sea? Why America's strategic ambiguity when it comes to the parameters of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and whether the Mutual Defense Treaty as it is being interpreted nowadays by the Biden administration is relevant to the disputes? In fact, the big question is, should we revise the guidelines undergirding the MDT in order to make sure that it's relevant to the gray zone attacks and other forms of intimidation tactics employed by China? In order to understand these issues, we have a guest who understands American foreign policy and also developments on the ground. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, we have had the pleasure of conversing with each other throughout the months in different kind of platforms, but lots has happened since last time we had a conversation. Of course, off the record, this was in Stanford earlier this year. Strangely Dialogue was the latest development. I want to ask you a little bit about what is your take on the interventions by the Chinese delegation, the first Chinese delegation of full-fledged delegation in quite some time, and then also the American side in terms of Secretary Lloyd Austin's statements on the Philippines and U.S. alliance and implications for the South China Sea disputes, and obviously President Marcos Jr.'s keynote speech, the highlight. But before going there, let's start with you a little bit because you have had the distinction of being at the receiving end of a lot of conspiracy theories from very, let's say, partisan sides. Just for the purpose of clarity, for those who may not know the real score in terms of where you're coming from and the organization you work with, can you just clear the air for?
Well, when they say I was a 34-year military veteran, that is true. I was in the Air Force for 35 years. I was actually started here in the Philippines. I was based at Clark Air Base a long time ago, back before Mount Pinatubo, and in fact, met my wife here, and we left when Mount Pinatubo told us to leave. So we left on the evacuation. Basically, worked all over the world in that capacity, a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific, some time in the Pentagon, a little bit of time in Europe. Of course, everybody had to go to the Middle East at some time.
Yes.
And then in the end, I ended up back in the Indo-Pacific, working as an attaché in Vietnam and then in Australia. And then I retired in 2021. And I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do next, so I went back home, which was California, and that's how I ended up at Stanford University. And while I was at Stanford, I started a project with something called the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. And I had been fascinated by the West Philippine Sea situation going back many, many years. I was frustrated because I thought that a lot of the way that we approached it as the United States lacked a strategy.
Right.
I didn't understand the strategy, even though I had to sort of, put on my best face as a diplomat and try to explain the strategy. And so I thought, what is that has been making China so successful in making advances in the West Philippine Sea? And after running through the Gordian Knot Center, running through this entrepreneurial process, I came to the conclusion that they were able to do it in what we still call, in many corners, the gray zone, where things are not very clear. Things are kind of opaque. They're kind of hard to tell. And so for as long as that was true, it was easy for them to just make advance after advance after advance, just slowly slicing away little pieces. And so we thought, what if we could figure out a way to make it so that every little aggression could be highlighted, right? Every time we see a maritime militia vessel harassing a fisherman, every time we see a China Coast Guard harassing the Philippine Coast Guard, and also other countries, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, what if we could just highlight it so that the gray zone is not so gray? And so in the beginning of last year, we started to put some things out, and about the same time, the Philippine government decided that it would also embrace transparency.
Right.
And that was a really exciting time because, of course, all of a sudden, everything started moving very, very quickly. And so we were putting our things out, and the Philippine government was also putting out much more interesting things with pictures and video, but the two efforts were sort of complementary. Our organization, Sea Light, is essentially all volunteer,
Right.
including myself. So I live on my military pension. I get a little money for disability from my military service. My wife works at an elementary school, and I do some consulting on the side. And that's where my funding comes from. So Sea Light itself has got by on almost no outside money whatsoever, almost all based on sort of the goodwill of some imagery companies and those who work with us, and some relationships we've developed through our Stanford contacts. But yeah, it's I know that the theories hold that I have contacts with all kinds of nefarious.
But what is
Go ahead.
the Gordian Knot Center?
Yes.
I mean, a lot of them are ex-government officials at the highest levels, right? These are people who are at the intersection of innovation, entrepreneurship, and also high-level government experience, right? So that's where the heft comes from, the connections and the technology. Yeah.
Well, the Gordian Knot Center is, of course, interested very much in national security, right? So, and a lot of that does come from some of the people who run it. And by the way, it's a very, very small organization. But the director, Joe Felter, is a former former U.S. military officer and Pentagon official. But he's also working very closely with a serial entrepreneur from Silicon Valley named Steve Blank, who helped found the whole thing based on his understanding about entrepreneurship. And that's kind of crucial to the way the whole thing works. Is the idea is we in defense tend to stop innovating because we work in a big bureaucracy. How do you reignite innovation in the defense space so that we can start to compete again with China and others? Yeah.
So if there's like social entrepreneurship, it's more like geopolitical entrepreneurship or national security entrepreneurship in a sense.
Exactly. It's in the name. Yeah.
That's a good genre. Yeah. Let me go back a little bit. When you say you felt America doesn't have a strategy, what do you mean? I mean, my understanding is that folks at CNES, for instance, Richard Fontaine, I think have a new book called The Lost Decade or something like that. I'm looking forward to review that. And I think the idea was during the Obama administration and all the way bleeding into the Trump administration, there was kind of a window where America had significant geopolitical edge over China, and China was not yet this kind of a gargantuan superpower. And for some reason, the red lines were not clear, right? We saw the quote-unquote pink line on Syria, which really didn't work. And then there was supposed to be this conversation between President Paramount leader Xi Jinping and Obama, 2015, whereby there was a promise not to militarize. So many see that as a slap on the face of the Obama administration in America, or maybe the U.S. did not make the lines even clear when they had to. What was going on there? Because partly I also understand it as dismissiveness. I remember very well when in 2013 December, when China started with this kind of a geoengineering on steroids, fake island building and all of that, I was hearing a lot of dismissive statements. In fact, more than a year or so, I was still hearing dismissive statements that, those fake airlines, we can just bomb the hell out of it. And then suddenly by 2016-17, the conversation is changed. It's like, no. This is changing facts on the ground with clear military and tactical implications, not to mention strategic implications. Was America too dismissive or arrogant or too naive when it comes to the China challenge?
I would say naive, I think, really well describes what we were for many years. And I would go all the way back to the end of the Cold War. So we had this unipolar moment, right, where the Soviet Union was now a spent force. It was unraveling. Russia was, a friendly nation at that point. There was no peer competitor. We actually actively went out and started dismantling our basing structure, because we didn't need all these extra bases that we had. We went out and we wanted our peace dividend, right?
Yeah.
We'd been fighting a Cold War for 70 years. We were done, or 50 years, we were done. We didn't have to fight it anymore. And so all of a sudden we're looking around and we're saying, well, where can we take back some money? And in that sense, China began its rise, and we looked at it as all goodness, right? Because what would happen inevitably in our naive view of the world, and I mean, there was a sort of a beautiful thing about it, right? You know, we're so happy, you know, we're so optimistic, and that's sort of an American trait.
People were making a lot of money too.
Exactly, sure.
It's not just
In China, right?
Of course.
And so the idea was, well, China is making a ton of money. They're not going to want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, right? So we just need to kind of keep them moving, and eventually, you know, they'll liberalize even more and even more. And so when the signs began to emerge that wasn't going to happen, we kind of missed them as a nation. Now, I'm not saying everybody. There were people who were canaries in the coal mine and all of that. But I would say as a nation, we were naive. And so I was in Hanoi from 2013 to 2016 during the entire island building campaign. And the Vietnamese, who knew the Chinese very well, you know, were sort of looking at us and saying, okay, where's the American response? And to be frank, we didn't really have much of one. And on your point about the military value of these island bases that they've built out, so that idea that, well, they're militarily insignificant because they're very easy to attack, completely overlooks the fact that in a gray zone fight, in a gray zone conflict, where you can forward stage
Makes
all of your big Navy, Coast Guard, militia vessels at those places. 30, you know, Mischief Reef is about 30 kilometers away from Ayungin Shoal, right? How hard is it to enforce a blockade when you can just take everything back to Mischief Reef when you don't have to be there?
So they're forward deployment multipliers.
Yes, it's just force projection is all it is. So when you're China all the way up to there to the north, you don't have to, everything doesn't have to recover all the way back to Hainan Island every time you want to sort of rest a little bit. You can just go over to Mischief Reef and then pop back over. And that has been a huge enabler for them. And so, I mean, I think naivete had a lot to do with it.
What about the aspect, I don't want to litigate this in favor of Obama or try to apologize for him, but there was also this aspect of the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan. America's bogged down, the financial crisis and its long-term impact on American politics and society and economy. And then, of course, from my understanding, John Kerry, for instance, when he was the Secretary of State, I think he met his Iranian counterpart more than any other foreign minister because of the Iranian nuclear negotiations, which were extremely fraught because of the opposition from Arab side, by Israeli side. So there were times that here in ASEAN, we were looking at the United States and felt they were like too distracted. Like getting out of the mess in the Middle East was a mess in itself, right? Because of many factors. So sometimes we wondered if even the Obama administration had the bandwidth. Again, I'm not trying to apologize for Obama, but this is what you hear from them, or you read in memoirs that comes out of people at the high level officials in the Obama administration. What do you say to that line of argumentation?
I think there's plenty of blame to go around, you know. And to be fair, I don't know that there was a way to pitch a perfect game through all this. China was going to rise. You know, that's sort of the question. Now, again, so, and it apparently was not going to liberalize regardless of what we did. So, you know, but I think that even going back further than that, when we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it is important to not forget what happened on 9/11, right? There was no way the United States was not going to take some action. Now, that doesn't mean we had to do everything we did, and it certainly doesn't mean we did everything right. But, I mean, Afghanistan was almost a given. It had to happen, you know. Now, again, doesn't mean we did everything right.
Which was supported by a lot of regional powers.
NATO invoked Article 5. I mean, it was definitely supported. Iraq was obviously more controversial. I will say there was, and this goes back to naivete, right? There was, I think, coming out of the end of the Cold War, with the turning of all of these formerly communist states to capitalism and market economies and democracy, I think that there was this idea that democracy was just this contagious thing. And if you could just implant it somewhere and everybody could see how successful it was, then there would be a revolution, and all of us, you know, a good revolution, say, across these Middle Eastern nations that are, you know, and that democracies don't go to war with democracies. And there was just a lot of hopefulness and optimism that this could happen.
Triumphalism, rather.
And so, well, you know, again, some of it is it's a little bit understandable if you sort of put yourself back in the day and you look and you see what happened throughout Eastern Europe and other places, and even places in Asia that took on these democracies that were sort of blossoming. And the idea was, this is the end of history, right? This is where everything is going, and all we have to do is help it along a little bit. So here's where I'll say, things sort of got sideways. Obama came in and he did promised, at first he said the word was pivot. We'll pivot to Asia, right? Then that got a lot of people excited, so they toned it down and they said, we're going to just rebalance to Asia. And there was sort of a rebalance that never actually really happened. And the world just kept intervening, and so we had flare-ups in Afghanistan, flare-ups in Iraq, eventually we've had, the mess in Ukraine. The world refused to stop spinning in the same direction. And so there are, a lot of people now who look and say, we talk about, lost decade. Why is it that we never really got around to look, sort of turning ourselves completely to this part of the world that we tell everybody, this is the pacing threat. This is where everything is going to happen, and we just never quite get there. Now, again, I think that we are getting there, but I think it's a lot slower than what would have been sort of optimal.
Of course, this is the View from Manila, in a sense that you're someone, of course, who's personally also invested in this bilateral relationship, in as much as intellectually and policy-wise for quite some time. What do you say to those who felt and who contend that it looks like the Philippines was also taken for granted for quite some time in terms of the quality of relationship? I mean, there are many Filipinos who would disagree with this argument and say, no, it's our fault. We never build our domestic industrial military complex. We're too corrupt, blah, blah, blah. And then I say, well, I can think of Pakistan, I can think of Jordan, I can think of, a lot of those countries that are not US Treaty allies, that are not democracies at all. And yet they have had access to very high-end American weapon systems, F-16 fighters, Abrams tanks. And it kind of makes me scratch my head. Is it because the Philippines hasn't been seen important enough, or the China threat was not seen important enough? Because in the great scheme of things, what is ISIS compared to a global superpower? I mean, of course, I'm not drawing moral equivalence.
Right.
ISIS is a terrorist group, no question about it. But in terms of security threat, you're talking about the biggest navy on earth here in the South China Sea. Well, Jordans of this world are facing what? A bunch of terrorist groups. So I just feel that was where I found some sort of gaps in our alliance, because the Philippines is very vital to holding the ground, as we will discuss very shortly. So I felt the lost decade was also a lost decade of opportunity of investing in this bilateral relationship. I think President Aquino, who was very strongly for the pivot to Asia, probably the only one who openly backed the pivot to Asia among Southeast Asian countries, who openly supported Japan's growing defense role in the region during the Abe administration. I'm not sure he had a single state visit, I just feel there are many gaps in terms of the alliance. What is your understanding? What was going on there? Where did we go wrong?
We
as in all of us, not only America.
No, I think if you look at it realistically, every state, regardless of who you are, every country acts in its own national interest as it perceives it, right? So the U.S. clearly, for many, many years, was preoccupied with other threats, other things around the world. So when you decide what you need to do from a national security perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, and you sit and you rack and stack all of those into your list of priorities, and who you need to invite for a state dinner, and who you need to spend money on their defense, it actually does not come ultimately from a place where you say, well, the Philippines are our good friends, we should give them more. Ultimately, the cold-hearted realism that says, well, we have to make sure that this situation in the Middle East doesn't get out of control, and so maybe Jordan needs some more tanks. And a lot of those things are legacy too. Once you start giving money in a particular direction, it's amazingly hard to stop. Because once you take it away, it's like this huge issue, right?
Right.
So, and frankly, right now, as I often say, this is actually the perfect time for the Philippines to be making its case.
Yes.
Because everybody is now looking at this region and saying, wow, this is what the threat looks like. This is the face of the threat.
Well, you have a kind of a Davao connection by your wife's side. What is your understanding of the Duterte period? Because there are many ways to to approach this. Of course, this is not about the domestic politics.
I understand.
What I'm saying is, it's inevitable that their allies sometimes are gonna have moments of frustration and they're gonna express it in different ways. I can talk about Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, a major ally under NATO alliance. We can talk about even South Korea sometimes singing to a different tune. So my sense is sometimes there's a lot of blaming of the Philippines because of the Duterte period, and my argument would be, what about the other Filipino administrations who were actually standing up to China, or at least not going all the way pro-China? And even under the Duterte administration, the Philippine national security establishment was mature. I mean, you had Secretary Lorenzana, you had Teddy Locsin, many people in the military that I'm sure you're even more familiar with than me. What is your understanding of that? Do you think that's more of an excuse being used for saying the alliance is behind the curve, or you think that there was some legitimate fears that if we help the Philippines under the guise of someone like Duterte, assuming he's even okay with that help, this could go in the wrong way? The reason I ask it is because, for instance, Thailand, another Southeast Asian treaty ally of US, we can debate about how treaty ally is, but one reason, for instance, they have been asking for F-35 fighters, right? They're a little bit ahead of curve compared to Philippines, but my understanding is that there are some quarters in DC who are saying, they're too close to China. I'm not sure I want to give them that F-35. Something else might pop up in Beijing later on. Was there a dynamic like that? Because some people in the Philippines would argue that to explain the gaps in the relationship.
I don't think so, because what was interesting about that entire period from 2016 to 2022 was that even though President Duterte had very personal feelings about the United States, was not shy about expressing them, and made visible overtures to Beijing, the military-to-military relationship actually did okay. And some of that is just a testament to all of the work that had gone into it.
Legacy.
Exactly.
Legacy, yeah.
I mean, there are so many ties that kind of hold it all together. And even President Duterte, who talked very, very quickly about taking the VFA apart, it never came apart. Ultimately, it stuck. I would say that the thing that probably, and again, nothing about Philippine domestic politics, but I think that perhaps the thing that the Duterte period did was to downplay the threat from China, which then does not. So again, we can be very reactive to what the perceived threat is, right? So if you're looking across the board and you're saying who's facing a threat, and you've got the Philippines saying, yeah, we got a threat, we're good, then there's not sort of an inspiration to say, how do we address that threat, right? Through our foreign military sales and foreign military financing and all of our various programs, other countries may get prioritized over you. So the love goes to Vietnam or to somebody else because they're talking more about their threat. So I think that maybe that was one of the lost opportunities of the Duterte era.
So you're saying it's not about the threat supposedly to the alliance per se, but it's about not playing on the real threat from China in order to get more out of the alliance. That's a very different way of reading it. Yeah.
And to put a positive spin on it, what President Marcos has done over the past 18 months is really extraordinary. And I mean, if you look at now, the fact is that you have the full attention of the U.S. and its allies. I mean, you cannot look away from the images you see on the screen. And all it is the sailor on the deck of the ship turning on the camera, or the embedded reporter, making the report, and it is so clear what's happening. And so now all of a sudden, is there? I mean, I can't prove this. This is a counterfactual, but is it realistic to think that President Marcos would be asked to give the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2024 if the Philippines had not gone public about the threat from China and actually? I mean, really, the Philippines has changed the game, and that is. I mean, I would assert that is what ultimately
that's your wager.
That's what got President Marcos front and center to make his case to the world on an international stage. So I mean, I think that's maybe the opportunity that was lost in the Marcos or in the Duterte administration and is being exploited in the Marcos administration.
Well, I mean, just my understanding of that is this is just a natural progression of what the Aquino administration started. My understanding is anyone except Duterte would have been in this position 4 or 5 years ago or so. So in a way, I think President Marcos Jr. has to be credited for doing the right thing, but I think this is not a right thing out of nowhere. It's a continuation of the good foundation laid down by the Aquino administration, among others. But going back to the Shangri-La Dialogue, was there something that worried you about the Chinese delegation? Because it's called a dialogue.
Yeah.
It's not called a rant.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm not sure the Chinese brought a military more than a troll army, right? I mean, they were just asking questions in every major speech and intervention, and they were just ranting. it's not question and answer. I mean, if I were the moderator, I would be even more aggressive and say, "Sir, what is your question
Yeah.
again?" Right?
Yeah.
And there were times whereby it really got bizarre when they were pretending to be speaking in behalf of Asia and ASEAN,
Yeah.
and trying to present the Philippines, for instance, in the Q&A with President Marcos Jr., presented the Philippines as if we're the outlier, we're the American deputy sheriff in
course,
Southeast
yeah.
Asia, and all of that nonsense. And honestly, I don't think it went down well. I think it just showed the Chinese delegation was there to just impress their bosses back in Beijing.
I think that that is certainly, I think, an apt observation. And this is something that many people in the diplomatic community, of which I used to be a part, have been noticing for years, is this gradual deterioration of the dialogue with China, because they have less and less and less room to actually have a dialogue.
Yeah.
So when they send the delegation, they are sent with messages, and they are there to deliver those messages. They, to the extent that they're listening to write a report and send it back up. But those reports are likely mostly about how they sent their messages. I often tell the story. I had a job when I was a diplomat. I would meet with one of my counterparts from China, and I would say, "Okay, so here's what we're trying to do." And in the middle of my sentences, he would interrupt me, and he'd say, "Wait, I have to tell you something." And I'd say, "Okay, well, tell me something." And then he'd say, "Tell me this thing," and I'd say, "Okay, great." And then I would start again, and he'd interrupt me again. And I finally figured out he had a list of things he had to tell me so that he could go back and write his report up to the Beijing to say, these are all the things that I told the Americans.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not the way that it was before. It used to be you could have the official conversation, then you could have the side conversation where everybody got real. And that side conversation just isn't happening anymore.
I find that quite interesting in the sense that last November there was a meeting, second important meeting between President Biden and paramount leader Xi Jinping after Bali, and then you had the San Francisco meeting on the Alliance of APEC. The whole idea is we're going to agree to disagree on a lot of issues, and sometimes the disagreements could get tense, but that's exactly why we need guardrails.
Yeah.
So this was the first meeting in 18 months between the American and the Chinese chiefs, defense chiefs. But did something really come out of it? Do you think there are concrete steps towards institutionalized dialogue, cues, and other forms of military-to-military dialogue? I mean, as a former military man, how worried are you with China, like, leveraging dialogue?
Yeah.
I mean, dialogue is an ipso facto. I mean, you have diplomacy precisely to talk to rivals, if not enemies. You don't have diplomacy to talk to friends and factotums, right? That's not how it works. So I really find it very immature and very potentially destructive for China to leverage even dialogue.
It is very troubling, because what it suggests is that China may be reaching the point where the paramount leader is isolated, making all of the decisions sort of within an extremely tight circle, and is no longer hearing what people are saying to China. And that's how countries stumble into
Sleepwalk into,
very, very serious confrontations
dangerous
and
waters,
worse. And so, we would like to be able to see there be air gaps where you can get messages through so that you can send clear messages. And it's not really clear to me where those air gaps are now. So I think it is troubling. It is something to be very concerned about. And ultimately, it's going to have to chase us back to an old term that we used to use during the Cold War, back with the Soviets. We're going to have to make a much better deterrent, so that when Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning and looks out at his security situation, he does not think that this is a good day to go to war.
Yeah. We have to make them think twice at least, right? Speaking of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea right now and in the South China Sea, there's the optimistic view that China is hitting the wall, in a sense that the gray zone strategy is not working, in a sense that it's not having the intimidation effect that China was looking for.
Yeah.
At the same time, Filipino servicemen are getting injured.
Yes.
Our vessels are getting damaged. Our supply capabilities are getting degraded. Some of our resupplies, even from air, are getting disrupted. How do you see this going? And how do you think nature will intervene? As we speak, it's a very grimy London-like weather out there. You think that nature could help in terms of bringing down tensions? Because it's going to be harder to do major maritime moves and maneuvers when you have monsoon around the corner.
There's a flip side to that, which of course it's harder also to do things like resupplying a rusty ship sitting on a shoal in the middle of the water. I am concerned I have seen, I believe that what China has, so China had a period of introspection, I think, from the early last year into about the summer, where it was trying to figure out what to do about the Philippines' harder stance and its transparency initiative. And it seemed to me in about July of last year, China made a choice where I saw all of a sudden the amount of ships that it had in the West Philippine Sea escalate very significantly. And really since then, China has been looking for ways to try to escalate the Philippines off its position, trying to send the message that we can endure the pain longer than you can.
Yeah.
And so now we're going to stop short of anything that invokes the Mutual Defense Treaty we don't want. I don't think they want a war. I think what they want to be able to do is put the Philippines on the back foot so that the President Marcos is forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. President Marcos, on the other hand, has been trying to strengthen his alliance relationships, to work on maritime capacity building, all of those kinds of things that you have today to do to make yourself a more resilient nation. And that's also been effective. But the escalation has continued to rise. I'm still monitoring an increased number of ships at Scarborough Shoal. Now we're looking at the situation at Sabina Shoal, and this looks to be the new battleground. So Sabina Shoal, you've got Mischief Reef, you've got Ayungin Shoal, Second Time Shoal, then you've got Sabina Shoal, Escoda Shoal, and that's the closest one to Palawan, and that's where the action is now.
And who knows, the Whitsun Reef again, Juan Felipe Reef also could once again become a flashpoint, as we saw a few years ago.
Yeah, Whitsun Reef is mostly just a place that they park 100
militia armada
vessels, and they tie them all together, and they just sit there as like a permanent floating outpost, so that they can say they've always been there. So there hasn't been a lot of. There actually has never been a lot of action there. It's just that they sit there, and over time, what the intent is to say, China's always owned this.
Let's go to this issue, because I think the worry a lot of us have is, okay, I think I put it to The Economist magazine. I said, if this were boxing, which is one of our favorite sports in this part of the world, there's no knockouts, barely any knockdown. This is going to be a 12-round fight. Probably we're just round 5, and Philippines, I think, got round 5. As you correctly pointed out, round 1 to 4 probably went to China, because everyone else was either sleeping on the job or not doing enough to respond, or in the case of Duterte, just denying the situation, going completely ostrich. But there's going to be round 6 and 7 and 8, and who knows, there could be all sorts of different permutations to China's strategy. Now, one way I look at it is the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty reassurances, especially since 2019, February, March, when Pompeo was here in Manila. It may have worked in terms of dissuading China from doing something too stupid or too funny, but it hasn't been very effective in terms of gray zone. Nevertheless, one shift I've seen over the past few weeks or so, and we saw that very much in the Shangri-La dialogue, is the statement that I don't care if you use water cannon or actual cannons. If you kill a Filipino serviceman, that's a declaration of war. That's a red line. And therefore, by implication, Philippines would respond and the Mutual Defense Treaty should apply. Do you think that more outcome-oriented approach to the parameters of MDT is more reasonable than, and more sensible and effective perhaps than the modality approach? Because the modality is, as long as you don't use guns or cannons, it's not it's still gray zone. But our argument is, no. That's the wrong way of looking at it, because you can still kill us with water cannons. So it's the effect that it could have could also be a basis for activation of mutual defense. Do you think that's the sound way forward and perhaps the step in the right direction, but eventually what should be the package of responses beyond transparency?
So first of all, the term red line has always been a problematic one. Everybody hates the term. It for two reasons. One, of course, is it sort of ties your hands if something happens and you don't want to take the next step, well, you've already laid out the red line. You talk about Syria, right? The other is that there is a little bit of an implicit permission structure that you set up. You say, I get to do everything up until this point, So, and you don't mean to do that, but it's kind of what's conveyed. I think it's helpful, frankly, that the president does kind of throw out there, hey, Beijing, by the way, you could kill somebody, and that would put us in a whole different space. It doesn't. Now he called it. He used the term act of war in a sentence. That didn't mean he's declaring war. It doesn't mean you're going to war. A blockade is an act of war, and one's been happening at Second Thomas Shoal for years. So an act of war has been committed, the way we often define it, against the Philippines in many ways, kind of under the radar for a very long time.
Sure.
And nobody went to war, but it's helpful to sort of call it what it is so that, I mean, honestly, at this point, Ray Powell's view, I mean, China in many ways should be treated as a pariah state for the kinds of things that it does, because these aggressions are not normal for a responsible large power, right? And they should be treated as abnormal and outrageous. Okay. So where do we think things will go? I think that there needs to be a great priority placed on capacity building for the Philippines, which is where I think, at least some of the value of this administration's transparency policy should be coming into effect. With that international stage that he had at Shangri-La, with that invitation to Washington, D.C. for the trilateral summit, with the quadrilateral summit in Hawaii among the defense ministers, and then coming into reality with the decisions to support the Philippines with Japanese radars and 97-meter Coast Guard vessels, dark vessel detection from Canada. And this is the time when the Philippines should be arguing from a position of strength to the United States and say, hey, remember all those things we have on the list of priorities for Indo-PACOM and OSD for the things that should be going for partners and allies? I hope you're pushing the Philippines up that list, because we're taking a lot of risk here.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of proposals, including semi-low-hanging fruits, like, for instance, some of the new decommissioned corvettes or frigates or littoral combat ships perhaps could be passed on to the Philippines. I mean, because, giving new guns and all is going to take time. I mean, but there are things that could be done in the next year or 2 years, right?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, the reason I'm saying this is because, and we're going to go towards that, just like the United States, the Philippines, domestic politics is also in a flux. We don't know who's going to come after Marcos Jr. So it's important to, for the lack of a better term, Duterte-proof this not only alliance but foreign policy direction, which in my opinion is the floor. That's what any self-respecting sovereign nation would do. This is not anything aggressive or crazy or out of this world or extra courageous. What are the low-hanging fruits or semi-low-hanging fruits that can be done in the next year or so?
Well, I think, you start with some of the investigations that are already going on in the Philippines, the Senate investigations, others that are looking into some of these places where there has been foreign interference in Philippine national affairs, whether it be a mayor of a small town near Pampanga, or whether it be the Pogos, or places like this. This is actually the building of national resilience against an outside aggressor who is actively infiltrating your government structures or your societies, or if you can turn the lights on there, that is a corrective toward future. That would make it much harder for some future politician to come in and say, oh no, it's not a big deal, right? Because everybody has seen what's going on when the mayor of a small town owns a helicopter and 14 luxury vehicles, and seems to come from nowhere. Now, we don't know that she was an agent of the Chinese state. She may simply have been an agent of a criminal syndicate.
Or useful idiot, as the Soviets put it.
Yeah, but I mean, regardless, this is the way to sort of correct some of the things that maybe had been below the surface need to be surfaced. So that building of national resiliency, I think, is a big part of, it's the same thing in the United States.
Of course.
We were asleep for a long time, and now we find out that we've had things going on in, kind of that we hadn't been paying much attention to, that maybe now we need to pay a little bit of attention. So, for example, we're having this discussion about TikTok. Now, a lot of people in the Philippines and America use TikTok. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with the way the discussion is going. But at least now we're having a real discussion, and we're saying, we can't just wave away national security because it's inconvenient. Sometimes you have to take on some inconvenience in order to deal with a threat if it is real.
And not allow, authoritarian superpowers to weaponize our freedom of speech against ourselves.
Absolutely.
To undermine our democracy and national security.
We had so as you know, I have a podcast I do with my friend Jim Caruso, and we had on the former commander of Marine Forces Cyber, Marine Corps Cyber, which was Lieutenant General retired Lori Reynolds. And she said, Ray, as a military person, if I told you that I could take a phone with an app on it, that I could control the algorithm and I could collect all the data, and you could give that to every Chinese military officer would you want me to do that? I bet you would. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'd want you to do that. I could control how the news gets to them, what news is prioritized over other news, right? So all the
And they can
pro-American
control
stuff.
what gets out. I mean, a lot of us had weird experiences. Suddenly the phone turns off. Suddenly the temperature is high when I discuss China, South.
Yep.
I have all of these things. I've been collecting all of these evidences. A lot of us here covering the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea issue have seen all sorts of weird stuff about this particular app. Which, by the way, I don't have it on my main phones. It's on a burner phone. Just to be clear. Yeah.
I get it. It's hard to ignore because so many people look at it. The problems are technical. It is an extremely intrusive app. It collects information off of almost all of your other apps.
Yeah.
So, and all of that goes to a parent company that's in Beijing, right? ByteDance lives in Beijing. Now, do we know exactly how they're using it? No, but we probably won't, and that's part of the problem.
That's part of the problem. Let's talk about the United States. I think it's a good point to end this conversation. I hope we'll have more of this conversation over the coming months as we get closer to elections in the U.S. among others. I know for a fact that you're really non-partisan. You can get as non-partisan as you can get. Many people pretend to be above the fray, but I do believe that you are very completely a non-partisan person. What is your understanding of the continuities and discontinuities we may see after next year's turnover of power or continuity?
Sure. Well, obviously, if it's a second Biden administration, we don't have to say too much about that. I think we kind of know where that's going. There are always turnovers from one administration
But
to the
do
next.
we? I mean, the reason I ask is this. For instance, we saw with the Obama administration, there were many times, I think even Obama at some point said, when it's your second term, you don't care about re-election anymore.
Yeah.
You can go the whole 9 yards, or you can take certain risks that you couldn't take in the first term. So some of the major diplomatic moves of Obama happened in his second term.
Yeah.
Do you think Biden will be in a position to seal the deal or close the show, whether it's IPEF, whether it's some big defense deal and all of that, if he has a second term?
Well, I think the thing to start with is that there's not a big deal in the works now. And you could say, again, maybe a criticism of the Obama administration, which is also a subtle criticism of the other subsequent administrations, is he didn't close the deal on TPP before the end of his term. I think because he assumed that he would be succeeded by his Secretary of State, and now obviously that didn't happen. Obviously it does matter. And TPP is maybe the perfect example of when it matters, right?
Yeah.
The good news in terms of continuity is we actually have seen a version of the Trump movie before, right? And so we do have a general idea of what we can expect. Now, personnel is policy, and who he would bring in a second term does matter, right? Because a lot of the really fundamental things that were laid down by that early Trump administration were heavily influenced by really seasoned professionals like H.R. McMaster and James Mattis. New national security strategy, the first one that really correctly defined our relationship with China, lifted the blinders off of official Washington. And official Washington was ready to be convinced. I think there were lots of people. This is nonpartisan thing. It's just that somebody had to actually write it down and say, hey, we're going to have to compete with these folks because they've been competing with us for a very long time, and we haven't really been competing back. Again, James Mattis and the National Defense Strategy. These were really key documents. So what we're hoping is that we get that quality of appointments in what would be a second Trump administration. We kind of know where his impulses lie, right? We're probably going to have a confrontational kind of trade policy. That's not all a bad thing, right? If you're able to work it in the right way where you're, so our more confrontational trade policy with China was actually probably overdue, right? And we've mostly seen that continue through the Biden administration because frankly, these Chinese companies had been competing on such an unfair playing field for so long, it had to be corrected. So how does that affect the Indo-Pacific? The people that I have seen floated as senior officials in a second Trump administration have largely been people who are very favorable toward a focus on the Indo-Pacific. So I think that I can be pretty optimistic that might play to the advantage of a place like the Philippines. Not that I think that there's been anything wrong with the Biden administration's focus, but at least we say this is at least if there is a pullback from a part of the world, it's not going to be here.
Yeah, I mean, we had people like Elbridge Colby on this show, for instance, and the idea was it's an Asia first specific
Yeah.
first approach, and I think it's just not Trump. Other also key DeSantis, for instance, I think also articulated that earlier in the campaign. At the same time, we have folks also in Stanford, like Francis Fukuyama, Frank Fukuyama, whose argument is there could be the Schedule F situation, whereby there'll be a complete purge of many people in the national security establishment because of this whole deep state conspiratorial debate coming out of Trump and his whole MAGA movement. What do you think about that concern that there could be? Yes, you may have some superstar guys here and there as your national security advisor, NSA, people probably in State Department, Defense, but at the mid level or the lower levels, you're going to see a lot of hollowing out.
Yeah, I just tend to doubt that. I mean, so having been a mid-level, lower-level person in these large bureaucracies, it's just, first of all, it's almost impossible to carry out something like that. And it's not just the political problem that you're going to have. It's just, I mean, it's a lot of work to sort of go out. I mean, there was a time I remember in the early Bush administration when Donald Rumsfeld was very interested in reforming the defense civil service structure, and came up with an entirely new way to do it. And I think the objectives were honorable. He wanted to sort of make it more merit-based, and he wanted to sort of disincentivize some of the things that sort of lead to people just sort of sitting in a space, not doing very much and collecting a large paycheck. And so he was trying to sort of, and frankly, it took for a little while, and then it clicked back. So these bureaucracies are actually a lot harder to move. I mean, even in the Philippines, right? We talked before about the visiting forces agreement and the relationship with the United States. In the end, Rodrigo Duterte ran up against his own government and found out that his government didn't want to go as far as he wanted to go. And it didn't turn out that he wanted to just, ram right through him. He actually eventually sort of came to an accommodation.
And that's in a far less institutionalized democracy,
yes.
right?
I mean, Washington, D.C. is massive. It is very hard to get in there and sort of pull everything out. And, frankly, defense and diplomacy wouldn't even sort of be at the forefront of whatever I'd be afraid of.
And last point on this. What about the worry of a very polarized post-election scenario? I mean, we saw also already a version of that after 2020 elections. Could America's domestic, and now you're free. I mean, you're an American, so I'm sure you wouldn't have any hesitancy about commenting. Could the domestic politics really be a hurdle here? Because, it's one thing for America to be a superpower. It's another thing for America to be a values-based superpower. Yep. And when those values are kind of under question, in a world where the Russians and Chinese are waiting to just weaponize anything wrong on the part of America, aren't you slightly worried about the post-elections scenarios?
Yeah. I mean, this gets back to the question of what are the strengths and weaknesses of democracies versus autocracies, right? And autocracies do have a lot of asymmetric advantages. They're allowed to make decisions without consulting their people. But I think that actually has a fundamental weakness to it as well. And what you see is that when autocracies fail, they often fail very quickly and completely. And they tend to also become so isolated they are no longer making wise decisions, right? In a democracy and a capitalist system, it's chaotic. It's built chaotic. And in fact, it's intentionally built chaotic. We actually make a separation of powers to ensure it's chaotic because we want to make sure we don't end up with autocrats, right? And the people in charge are forced to listen to some degree. So part of the problem with TPP was that the Obama administration kind of saw the glide path to implementation and didn't pay enough attention to the politics behind it. Because ultimately you have to turn around, you have to be able to explain it to your people. And it could have been explained, but it wasn't a priority. So they kind of took their eye off the ball and forgot that even though this was the second Obama term, they were still answerable to the people, and because they didn't get it across the finish line, the people pulled the rug out from under them, right? And even the people who remained in government and wanted it done. So that is the peril of a democracy. I think it's good to remember that America has been in very polarized times before. I mean, there was a riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention. We had 2 assassinations that year of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. It was a terrible. We had an active terrorist organization running around blowing things up.
There was a mini civil war going on in America.
It was bad.
Yeah.
But sometimes in a democracy, it has to get bad so that everybody looks around and says, we got to stop doing this, right? And so, that's just one of the sort of ebbs and flows of a democracy. So I remain kind of, maybe I'm hopelessly rose-colored glasses. I remain a democracy enthusiast, a democracy believer, and I kind of think that this is just how we muddle through things in a democracy.
On a surprisingly positive note, or maybe this is the diplomat still in you. Thank you very much,
You're very kind.
Ray, for that very comprehensive discussion. Looking forward to more discussion in the near future.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.